Mom, did the money help with your medication? My son smiled as he asked the question over Thanksgiving dinner. I looked up slowly from my plate, confused by the warmth in his voice. It had been months since he'd sounded that relaxed around me. The turkey was still steaming in the center of the table. Outside the kitchen window, snow drifted quietly across the yard. What money? I asked. The room went silent. My daughter-in-law nearly dropped her wine glass. The $2,000 I've been wiring you every month, my son said carefully. For the past 3 years. I stared at him, because in 3 years, I had never received a single dime. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me where you're watching from so I can see how far this story reaches. The silence at that table felt heavier than the November snow outside. My son David slowly lowered his fork onto his plate. His forehead creased in confusion, though at first he still looked more puzzled than alarmed. Across from him, his wife Vanessa forced a tight smile and reached for her wine again, but her hand trembled slightly this time. I noticed because Vanessa never trembled. Not at weddings. Not during funerals. Not even the day my husband Harold died of a heart attack 2 winters ago, while shoveling snow outside our old Ohio home. Vanessa was always composed, always polished, always perfectly in control. Until that moment. I glanced down at the faded sleeves of my cardigan, suddenly embarrassed by how worn it looked under the bright dining room lights. I'd bought it from a discount rack almost 4 years ago, and stitched the elbow seam twice myself to keep it wearable. What are you talking about? I asked quietly. David blinked. The monthly transfers, Mom. I told you after Dad passed that I'd help out. I felt heat rise slowly into my face. David, I said carefully, I think you're mistaken. Vanessa laughed softly then. Too softly. Oh goodness, she said quickly. Maybe the bank had some issue with processing. You know how confusing these things can get. But David was no longer looking at her. He was staring at me now. Really staring. And I watched something terrible begin forming behind his eyes. Not anger. Not yet. Realization. For the first time in years he looked past the polite smiles and saw me clearly. Saw the thinning cuffs on my coat hanging near the door. Saw the grocery store reading glasses I'd taped together at the bridge. Saw how much weight I'd lost since Harold's funeral.
I sudanli wisha I de born makauptunikt.
I've been sending it every month, he repeated slowly. $2,000. Since January after Dad passed. My chest tightened. January. That had been the same month my electricity was nearly shut off during a snowstorm. The same month I started cutting my blood pressure pills in half because my insurance deductible reset. The same month Vanessa convinced me it would be simpler if all family paperwork went digital. I swallowed carefully. I never got any money, sweetheart. Vanessa set her wine glass down too fast. The sharp clink echoed across the dining room. Well, she said brightly, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. But no one answered her. Outside, wind brushed softly against the windows. The smell of rosemary stuffing suddenly made my stomach turn. David reached for his phone immediately. You had to receive it, he muttered, already scrolling through banking apps. There are records for everything. I watched his expression change line by line. Transfer confirmations. Routing numbers. Dates. Amounts. 36 separate payments. $72,000. Enough money to fix the leaking roof Harold used to promise he'd repair before retirement. Enough money to replace my 20-year-old furnace. Enough money to stop me from standing in pharmacy aisles calculating which prescriptions I could afford that month. My hands began trembling beneath the table. Not because of the missing money, but because my son looked devastated. And somehow that hurt even more. You never mentioned struggling, he said quietly. I almost laughed at that. Not cruelly. Just tired. Parents don't usually call their children to announce they can't afford medication, I replied softly. The words landed harder than I intended. David looked down immediately. Vanessa leaned forward too quickly. She's exaggerating, she said with a nervous smile. Eleanor's always been independent. I'm sure things weren't that bad. I looked at her then. Really looked at her. At the diamond earrings she wore casually to Thanksgiving dinner. At her manicured nails wrapped tightly around the stem of her wine glass. at the expensive cream sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. And suddenly memories started lining up quietly inside my mind, like puzzle pieces finally turning the correct direction. Vanessa insisting she help organize Harold's paperwork after the funeral. Vanessa offering to pick up my mail whenever weather got bad. Vanessa telling me paper bank statements were outdated and unsafe. Vanessa setting up easier online access on my accounts because older people get targeted by scammers. Older people. I remembered how small that phrase made me feel at the time. David looked up suddenly. "Mom," he said carefully, "can I see your bank account?" Vanessa's head snapped toward him. "David, honey, tonight's Thanksgiving. I just want to check something." His voice had changed. Quiet, controlled, businesslike. I recognized that tone. He used it during difficult negotiations at work. Harold used to say David sounded exactly like a lawyer whenever something smelled wrong. Vanessa smiled again, but now the edges looked strained. "There's probably some tiny misunderstanding," she said quickly. "Maybe Eleanor forgot the deposits were under another account." I shook my head slowly. "I only have one checking account." David stood immediately. "Can you log in?" The room suddenly felt too warm. My small dining room, once filled with years of family birthdays and Christmas dinners, now felt like the inside of a courtroom. No one touched their food anymore. The turkey cooled untouched at the center of the table, while David carried my old laptop onto the tablecloth Harold's mother embroidered 40 years ago. I noticed Vanessa watching the screen too carefully. Her breathing looked shallow now. My fingers shook slightly as I typed in my password. The balance appeared. $312.14. David stared. Then stared longer. "I don't understand," he whispered. He opened transaction history. Electric bill. Pharmacy charge. Grocery outlet. Gas station. Nothing else. No large deposits.
No monthly transfers.
No incoming payments at all. Vanessa suddenly stood up. "I think we're overwhelming your mother," she said quickly. "Maybe we should deal with this another time." But David ignored her. His eyes moved rapidly now between his own banking app and my transaction history. Then he froze completely. "What is that?" His voice sounded different. Sharper. I leaned closer. There, buried in transfer details on his phone, was an account number ending in 4428. But my account ended in 1173. David's face went pale. "That's not your account." The room stopped breathing. Vanessa's chair scraped suddenly against hardwood flooring. "Oh my God," she whispered, pressing a hand dramatically against her chest. "Maybe the bank mixed up numbers when we first set up transfers." David looked at her slowly. "When we set it up?" She opened her mouth, closed it again. And in that instant, I knew. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to feel something cold settle deep inside my chest. Not shock, not even anger. Recognition. The kind that arrives quietly after years of ignoring small discomforts. Like finally realizing a draft in the house wasn't coming from the windows, but from a door someone had deliberately left open. David stood so abruptly his chair nearly tipped backward. "Vanessa," he said carefully, "what account is this?" She swallowed hard. I don't know." But her voice cracked on the last word. And my son heard it too. David stared at Vanessa so intensely that even the soft hum of the refrigerator suddenly felt loud. For a few seconds nobody moved. Then Vanessa forced out a nervous laugh. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You're acting like I stole something." David didn't answer immediately. That frightened me more than if he had shouted. Because my son had inherited Harold's silence. And Harold only went quiet when he was deeply upset. David slowly turned the phone screen toward her. "The transfers were sent to an account ending in 4428, he said carefully. "Mom's account ends in 1173. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. "Well, maybe your assistant entered the wrong number." "I didn't give the assistant the account information," David replied. Another silence. Longer this time. Outside, snow tapped softly against the kitchen windows while the Thanksgiving candles burned lower between untouched plates of food. I suddenly remembered another winter evening almost 2 years earlier. Vanessa standing beside my mailbox. smiling politely when I pulled into the driveway. "Oh good," she'd said casually. "Your bank statement accidentally got delivered to our house." At the time I thought nothing of it. Families helped each other. That was what Harold always believed. But now, sitting at that table, old memories began returning one by one with terrifying clarity. Missing mail. Password resets. Vanessa insisting she helped manage online accounts. Even my phone mysteriously locking me out of banking apps several times over the years. David rubbed both hands over his face. "How long has this been happening?" he muttered. Vanessa's voice sharpened immediately. "David, stop acting crazy. Your mother probably forgot half. The deposits." I looked at her quietly. Forgot? I remembered counting quarters for laundry 6 months ago. Remembered wrapping myself in blankets because I was afraid to raise the heat too high during January. Remembered standing in a pharmacy aisle debating whether blood pressure medication was more important than groceries that week. People do not forget survival. David slowly lowered his hands. "She lost 15 pounds this year," he said softly. Vanessa rolled her eyes too quickly. "She's older now. Weight changes happen." But my son wasn't listening anymore. I could see him thinking backward through the last 3 years. Every birthday gift I politely declined. Every time I said I couldn't travel. Every excuse about trying to save money. And worst of all, every moment he believed I was financially comfortable because he thought he'd been helping me. The devastation on his face made my chest ache. "Mom," he whispered. "Why didn't you tell me things were bad?" I gave him a tired smile. "You were grieving too." Harold's death had shattered him. For months after the funeral, David buried himself in work. He called less often. Visited less too. I told myself that grief simply looked different in younger people. Maybe part of me had also been afraid. Afraid of becoming a burden. Vanessa suddenly grabbed her wineglass again. "This entire conversation is insulting," she snapped. "I've done nothing except help this family." David looked at her carefully. "Did you ever access Mom's banking information?" No, the answer came too fast. His jaw tightened. "Did you ever change account settings?" No. "Did you ever handle transfer paperwork?" I was trying to help. Her voice cracked suddenly. There it was again. Fear. Not irritation. Not offense. Fear. I sat perfectly still while they stared at each other across the dining room table. And for the first time in years, I realized I might not actually know my daughter-in-law at all. The woman I'd spent holidays with. The woman who hugged me after Harold's funeral. The woman who brought casseroles to my house while quietly taking over pieces of my life one password at a time. David suddenly stood again. "I'm calling the bank tomorrow morning." Vanessa's face lost color instantly. "That's unnecessary." "No," he replied coldly. "It really isn't." The room felt colder now despite the heat running through the vents. I noticed the candles had nearly burned down. Completely. Wax pooled silently onto the tablecloth. Thanksgiving dinner was over, though almost nobody had eaten. Vanessa grabbed her purse too quickly. "I think Eleanor is tired," she said sharply. "We should leave." But before she could move, David spoke again. "One more thing." She froze. His eyes locked onto hers. "Why does that account number look familiar to you?" Vanessa didn't answer. And that was the moment my son finally understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was betrayal. I barely slept that night. After David and Vanessa left, I sat alone at my kitchen table long after midnight, staring at the untouched pumpkin pie beside the sink. The house felt painfully quiet again, but now the silence carried something different. Not loneliness. Suspicion. The old wall clock ticked steadily above the stove while snow continued falling outside. Harold used to love the first snowfall of the season. Every winter he'd stand near the front window with a cup of coffee, smiling like a boy every time the yard turned white. For a moment I could almost picture him there. Then I remembered the look on David's face at dinner. That hollow expression when he realized I'd never received the money. And suddenly I started crying. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly into my hands like a woman who'd spent too many years trying not to inconvenience anyone. By morning my eyes burned from exhaustion. At 9 sharp David called. "Mom," he said immediately. "I'm outside." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. When I opened the front door, I barely recognized my son. His tie hung loose around his neck. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He looked like a man who hadn't slept at all. Behind him sat a black SUV I didn't recognize. The bank manager agreed to meet us privately, he explained. Can you come with me? I nodded without asking questions. The drive across town felt strangely formal. Neither of us spoke much. Christmas decorations already lined the streets, even though Thanksgiving had only been yesterday. People carried shopping bags. Couples laughed outside coffee shops. The whole world moved normally while my family quietly cracked apart inside that SUV. David finally broke the silence halfway there. I checked Vanessa's business account last night. I turned toward him slowly. There were transfers, he said flatly. Large ones. My chest tightened. How large? He swallowed once. Enough. That single word told me everything. We arrived at the bank downtown just after 10. The manager, a silver-haired woman named Carol, greeted us personally and led us into a private office near the back. Her expression changed the moment she saw me. Not surprise, recognition, and somehow that unsettled me even more. Mrs. Whitmore, she said gently, it's good to see you again. Again? I frowned slightly.
I'm sorry, he replied politely.
Have we met before? Carol hesitated, then glanced briefly at David. You came in about 18 months ago, regarding suspicious login attempts on your account.
He stared at her blankly.
No, I didn't. The room went still. Carol's professional smile disappeared immediately. David leaned forward slowly. What do you mean suspicious login attempts? Carol looked genuinely uncomfortable now. There were several requests to reset account passwords and mailing preferences. Your mother eventually confirmed the changes in person. I felt cold all over. I never came here. Carol blinked twice, then turned slowly toward her computer monitor. Could you wait one moment? She typed rapidly, opened files, scrolled, then stopped moving entirely. Oh dear. David's jaw tightened. What? Carol rotated the monitor slightly toward us. A scanned copy of an ID appeared on screen beside digital paperwork authorizing online banking changes. The photo was mine, but the signature wasn't. I knew instantly. After 50 years of signing birthday cards, tax forms, school papers, and mortgage documents beside Harold, a woman recognizes her own handwriting. And that signature did not belong to me. David stared at the screen in complete silence. Carol looked horrified. There are security camera logs attached to these visits, she said carefully. I can request archived footage. My heart started pounding. Somewhere deep inside me, denial still fought to survive. Maybe there was some explanation. Maybe Vanessa had misunderstood paperwork. Maybe then Carol enlarged another document. A contact authorization form. Emergency account access. And beside authorized family representative was Vanessa's name. David went completely pale. When was this added? He asked quietly. Carol checked the date. About 3 weeks after your father passed away. I closed my eyes briefly. 3 weeks. At that time I could barely get out of bed. Neighbors brought casseroles I never ate. Flowers filled the living room beside Harold's urn. I remembered Vanessa sitting beside me on the couch one afternoon holding my hand gently. You shouldn't stress about paperwork. Right now, she'd whispered kindly. I'll help with everything. Everything. The word echoed painfully in my mind now. David stood abruptly and walked toward the office window. I could see his reflection in the glass. Angry. Ashamed. Heartbroken. Not at the money. At himself. I trusted her, he said quietly. No one answered. Because there was nothing to say. Carol printed several pages carefully before sliding them across the desk. Transfer records. Authorization forms. Login history. 3 years of quiet theft hidden behind family dinners and polite smiles. I stared at the papers in disbelief. Not because of the money anymore, but because betrayal looked so ordinary in black ink. No screaming. No dramatic music. Just signatures. Dates. Account numbers. And trust slowly disappearing line by line. Top of form. David drove me home in silence after we left the bank. The printed documents rested on my lap the entire ride, though neither of us looked at them again. Outside the passenger window, the town moved through its normal Friday afternoon rhythm. Cars filled the streets. Christmas lights blinked across storefront windows. A little girl in a red coat laughed while chasing snowflakes outside a bakery. Everything looked peaceful. That almost made it worse. Because 3 years of lies had unfolded quietly beneath ordinary life. When we pulled into my driveway, David turned off the engine but didn't move. "I don't understand how I missed this," he said finally. I looked at my son carefully. At 42, he still had the same eyes he'd had as a little boy. Harold used to joke that David had inherited my softness and his stubbornness. A dangerous combination in this world. "You trusted your wife," I said gently. "But you were struggling." The pain in his voice cut deep. I reached over and touched his hand. Parents get good at hiding things. He shook his head immediately. "No, Mom. Not this." For a moment neither of us spoke. Then David leaned back heavily against the seat. "There's more," he admitted quietly. Something in my stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" He stared through the windshield. "Last night after we got home, Vanessa locked herself in our bedroom for almost an hour." He swallowed hard. "She was deleting things." A cold feeling spread slowly through my chest. Deleting what? She wouldn't let me see her phone. That told me enough. Because innocent people rarely panic before sunrise. Snow crunched softly beneath our shoes as we walked into my house together. The familiar scent of old wood and cinnamon candles greeted us immediately. Harold always said our home smelled like Christmas no matter what month it was. David stopped near the living room fireplace. His eyes landed on Harold's photograph sitting beside the mantel clock. And suddenly my son looked 10 years younger. Like a lost boy again. "I keep thinking about Dad," he said quietly. I lowered my coat onto the chair. "So do I." David rubbed both hands across his face. He trusted Vanessa too. That was true. Harold had adored her at first. We both did. I remembered the first Thanksgiving she spent with our family nearly 12 years ago. She'd arrived carrying homemade pecan pie and wearing a nervous smile. During dinner, she listened carefully to Harold's stories, laughed at his terrible jokes, and offered to help wash dishes afterward. "She's thoughtful," Harold whispered to me later that night while we cleaned the kitchen together. And she had seemed thoughtful. That was the frightening part. Manipulation rarely arrives looking cruel. It arrives smiling politely while offering to help. David sat heavily onto the couch. There were signs, weren't there? I didn't answer immediately. Because now that the truth had cracked open, yes, there had been signs. Small ones. Easy to excuse.
Vanessa discouraging surprise visite.
Vanessa answering David's phone constantly. Vanessa insisting family holidays rotate around her schedule. Vanessa gently mocking things she called old-fashioned, usually moments involving me or Harold. At the time, none of it felt serious enough to confront. Families compromise. Marriages evolve. People change. At least that's what I kept telling myself. David suddenly looked toward me. "Do you remember when she convinced you to switch to online banking?" I nodded slowly. "She said paper statements were unsafe." His jaw tightened. "She told me you were getting forgetful." The words landed quietly between us. Forgetful. I stared at the fireplace without really seeing it. Older women hear that word constantly. Forgetful. Confused. Too emotional. Need help managing things. Sometimes people say it kindly. Sometimes strategically. And sometimes they say it because they are preparing to take control. "I wasn't forgetful," I said softly. "I know." David's voice cracked slightly. "That's what kills me." The furnace clicked on softly as wind pushed against the house outside. Wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Sharp enough to make me sit down. "David." He looked up immediately. "The hospital forms." "What forms?" "The week your father died." I could feel my heartbeat speeding up now. Vanessa kept bringing me paperwork while I was sedated. David froze. "What kind of paperwork?" "I don't know." My voice sounded distant even to me. "Insurance maybe. Account access." I was barely sleeping back then. A terrible realization crossed his face slowly. "She got your signatures while you were medicated." I looked down at my trembling hands. Maybe not all of them, but enough. Enough to open doors that should have stayed closed. David stood immediately and paced toward the kitchen. I swear to God, I had never heard my son sound like that before. Not loud, not explosive, just deeply wounded. And suddenly I realized something heartbreaking. The stolen money wasn't the worst part for him anymore. It was discovering that while he thought he was protecting his mother, someone inside his own home had been quietly using his love against both of us. That evening, the house felt unfamiliar to me. Not because anything had physically changed, but because once trust disappears, even familiar walls begin to feel different. David stayed for dinner, though neither of us was hungry. I warmed leftover turkey soup while he sat quietly at the kitchen table scrolling through old financial records on his laptop. Every few minutes his expression tightened further. More transfers. More confirmations. More evidence that for 3 years he had faithfully sent money believing his mother was safe and cared for. And for 3 years I had lived like a woman trying not to drown. The kitchen lights reflected softly against the dark windows outside. Snow continued falling steadily now, covering the yard Harold once spent entire Saturdays maintaining. David suddenly looked up. "Mom," he said carefully, "did Vanessa ever ask for copies of Dad's documents?" I paused beside the stove. "Yes." "How many?" "I'm not sure." He exhaled slowly through his nose. "She had access to almost everything." A chill moved through me that had nothing to do with winter. Because Harold had been organized. Painfully organized. Every investment file. Every insurance policy. Every retirement account. Labeled neatly in his office downstairs. After the funeral, I hadn't even opened the door to that room for months. The grief was too heavy. Seeing his reading glasses still sitting beside his desk nearly broke me every time. Vanessa had volunteered to sort paperwork while I mourned. At the time I thought she was helping. Now I wondered how much she had actually been studying. David closed the laptop suddenly. "There's something else." His voice sounded strained again. "What is it?" He hesitated before answering. "The account receiving the transfers." He swallowed once. "It's connected to Vanessa's consulting business." I stared at him. "She used her business account?" He nodded slowly. My knees weakened enough that I had to grip the counter edge. Not because it was clever, because it was planned, careful, long-term. This wasn't one impulsive mistake. It was 3 years of deliberate deception hidden beneath ordinary family life. I sat down slowly across from my son. "Does she know you found out?" "I left before she woke up this morning." Something about that sentence made my heart ache. When David married Vanessa, he used to call her his safest place in the world. Now he was avoiding going home. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed softly. 7 o'clock. Harold always watched old Western movies around this hour. I could almost hear the television in the other room if I closed my eyes long enough. Grief was strange that way. Sometimes memories comforted you. Sometimes they simply reminded you who was missing when life fell apart. David leaned forward suddenly. "There's security footage from the bank." I looked up. "They're retrieving archived recordings from the branch visits," he explained. "If Vanessa impersonated you, she won't be wearing disguises like a criminal in movies," I interrupted quietly. He stopped speaking. And I realized something then. People imagine betrayal dramatically, but real betrayal usually wears familiar perfume. It sits across from you at Thanksgiving dinner. It hugs you at funerals. It tells you not to stress while quietly moving money behind your back. David's phone buzzed sharply against the table. Both of us froze instantly. Vanessa. Her name glowed across the screen beside a photo taken last summer at a lake house rental. She was smiling brightly beside David, sunlight catching the diamond bracelet on her wrist. A bracelet I suddenly wondered about. "She's called 16 times today," David muttered. "Are you going to answer?" He stared at the screen for several seconds, then declined the call. Immediately another message appeared. "Please come home. We need to talk." A second followed. "This isn't what you think." David gave a short, humorless laugh. "That's exactly what guilty people say." But I noticed his hands shaking slightly. Because despite everything, he still loved her. That was the cruelest part. Love doesn't disappear the moment truth appears. Sometimes it lingers painfully while everything else collapses. Another message appeared. I was trying to protect us. David stared at those words silently. Then he whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. From what? Neither of us had an answer. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller somehow. Heavier. Like the entire house was waiting for the next terrible truth to arrive. Then David's phone rang again. This time it wasn't Vanessa. It was the bank manager. He answered immediately. Yes. Silence filled the room while he listened. Slowly, all color drained from his face. What do you mean there were additional withdrawals? My heart stopped. David stood abruptly from the table. How much money are we talking about? David's face had gone completely white by the time he lowered the phone from his ear. For a moment, he simply stood there beside the kitchen table staring at nothing. I felt my pulse hammering painfully in my chest. David. He looked at me slowly, almost like he was struggling to process the words himself. There were other withdrawals, he said quietly. The room suddenly felt colder. What kind of withdrawals? He swallowed hard. Large ones. A terrible silence followed. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down heavily across from me. The bank manager reviewed linked transactions connected to Vanessa's business account, he explained carefully. Some of the money transferred from my account didn't stay there. I frowned. Where did it go? David rubbed both hands over his face again. Luxury purchases. Travel accounts. Private investments. Every word felt heavier than the last. I thought about the vacations Vanessa posted online. Wine country weekends. Spa resorts. Designer handbags she casually carried into family dinners. At the time, I assumed successful young couples simply lived differently now. I never imagined I might have helped pay for any of it without knowing. She spent it, I whispered. David nodded once. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The soup on the stove had gone cold. Outside, snow covered the backyard completely now, smoothing everything into quiet white. Stillness. It reminded me painfully of the winter Harold died. For weeks afterward, I moved through life like a ghost. I barely opened mail. Barely answered calls. Some mornings I sat in his recliner still wearing pajamas long after sunrise because getting dressed felt pointless. That had been the exact moment Vanessa stepped in. Helpful. Gentle. Organized. Now I understood something horrifying. She hadn't entered chaos accidentally. She had entered opportunity. David suddenly pushed his chair back. I need to show you something. He opened his laptop again and turned the screen toward me. Bank records filled the monitor. Rows of transactions. Transfer after transfer. Then he clicked another folder. Photos appeared. Vanessa at a luxury resort in Arizona last spring. Vanessa holding shopping bags outside designer stores. Vanessa smiling beside friends at some rooftop restaurant in Chicago. Dates matched the withdrawal records exactly. I stared quietly at the screen. Not angry. Just stunned by how ordinary betrayal could look. No villainous expression.
No dramatic confrontation.
Just polished smiles hiding ugly truths. She told me those trips were work conferences, David said bitterly. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. I looked at my son carefully then. Really looked at him. The exhaustion beneath his eyes. The humiliation. The heartbreak. People often talk about betrayal as rage. But sometimes betrayal is grief. Grief for the version of someone you thought existed. David leaned back slowly. There's more missing than I realized. How much? He hesitated. Then answered quietly. Over $200,000. I felt dizzy. That number didn't even sound real to me. $200,000. Enough money to completely change someone's life. Enough money to save for grandchildren's college. Enough money to care for aging parents comfortably. Enough money to destroy a marriage. David suddenly laughed once. Short. Empty. I thought I was being a good son. The sadness in his voice nearly broke me. You were, I said immediately. No, he shook his head hard. I sent money and stopped paying attention. That isn't your fault. But even as I said it, I knew guilt had already settled deep inside him. Children carry terrible guilt when they realize their parents suffered quietly, especially good children. And despite everything, David was still a good man. That mattered to me more than the money ever would. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Vanessa. Please don't do this to us. A minute later, we can fix this. David stared at the words with hollow eyes, then finally typed back. Fix what? The response came almost instantly. I made mistakes. Not I didn't do it. Not. There's an explanation. Mistakes. David closed his eyes briefly. And in that moment, I think the last piece of denial finally disappeared. The woman he loved had confessed without truly confessing. Snow rattled softly against the windows while silence settled over the kitchen again. Then David looked at me. There's one thing I still don't understand. What? Why didn't she just ask? I frowned slightly. For money, he clarified quietly. If she needed help, why steal it? That question lingered heavily between us. And strangely enough, I think that was the moment I finally understood Vanessa completely. Because people who steal out of desperation usually stop once survival is secured. But people who steal out of entitlement never believe they're taking enough. I folded my trembling hands together on the table. She stopped seeing me as a person, I said softly. David stared at me. She saw an old woman, I continued. Someone easier to move aside. Easier to control. The pain on his face deepened instantly. And I realized another terrible truth. For years, Vanessa hadn't only been stealing money. She had been quietly convincing my son that his mother was becoming weak, confused, dependent, so no one would question her taking control. The next morning I woke before sunrise. For a few peaceful seconds I forgot everything. Then reality settled back over me the moment I saw Harold's empty side of the bed. The missing money. The forged paperwork. Vanessa. I sat quietly on the edge of the mattress while pale winter light crept through the curtains. My joints ached from exhaustion. At 70 years old, sleepless nights settled into the body differently. Heavier. Slower. Downstairs, the coffee maker clicked softly in the kitchen. David was already awake. I found him sitting at the table wearing the same wrinkled shirt from yesterday. His laptop remained open beside untouched coffee. Judging by the dark circles beneath his eyes, he hadn't slept either. For a moment he looked exactly like Harold during difficult times at work 20 years ago. Tired men carry silence the same way. There's more paperwork, David said quietly before I even sat down. My stomach tightened immediately. He slid several printed pages across the table toward me. These were attached to the authorization forms. I adjusted my reading glasses slowly. Medical release documents. Emergency financial access. Insurance updates. And there, at the bottom of one page, my signature again. Except it wasn't mine. I stared at the shaky imitation of my handwriting, while something cold moved through my chest. She practiced it, David whispered. The realization made me feel sick. Not because it was illegal, because it was intimate. To copy someone's signature, you study them. You trace their movements. You learn the shape of their identity until you can imitate it convincingly. That level of deception doesn't happen accidentally. It grows quietly over time. She had access to Dad's office for months, David muttered bitterly. There were hundreds of documents down there. I closed my eyes briefly. Harold trusted family completely. He used to leave important papers sitting openly on his desk because, in his words, what kind of world would it be if you couldn't trust your own family? The memory nearly broke my heart. David suddenly pushed his chair back and stood. I found another account. I looked up sharply. What account? One I didn't know existed. Fear crept slowly into his voice now. Not just fear of losing money. Fear of how much he still didn't know. He turned the laptop toward me again. An investment account appeared on screen under Vanessa's business records. The balance made my breath catch. $87,000. I stared at the number silently. That came from my transfers too? I asked quietly. David nodded once. And possibly from Dad's retirement funds. The room tilted slightly around me. No, I whispered immediately. Harold protected those accounts carefully. David's jaw tightened. She had access after his death. The sentence hung heavily between us. After his death. Everything led back to those terrible weeks after Harold passed away. The grief. The confusion. The medications. The endless paperwork I barely understood through exhaustion. That was when Vanessa moved closest. Helping. Organizing. Taking control. And I suddenly realized something that frightened me deeply. She hadn't stolen from me after I became vulnerable. She had waited for vulnerability first. David's phone buzzed sharply against the table. Vanessa again. This time he answered. What? I could hear her crying immediately through the speaker. Not soft crying. Dramatic crying. The kind meant to pull people back emotionally before logic settles in. David, please, she sobbed. You're making this look worse than it is. His expression hardened instantly. Worse than what? Silence. Then, I was trying to protect our future. I saw pain flash across my son's face. Not because he believed her anymore. Because part of him still wanted to. How much did you take? He asked quietly. Her crying stopped. That frightened me more than anything else.
No denial. No outrage.
Just silence. Finally she whispered. I didn't mean for it to go this far. David closed his eyes. And in that moment, I watched my son's marriage truly begin collapsing. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like ice cracking underneath someone who realizes too late they've been standing on something fragile for years. What about my mother? He asked. Vanessa didn't answer immediately. Then she said something I will never forget. She didn't need that much money anyway. The kitchen went completely still. I felt every ounce of warmth leave my body. David stared ahead in absolute disbelief. And suddenly I understood the full truth. Vanessa had not seen me as family anymore. Not even as human in the same way she saw herself. Just an aging obstacle. A quiet old woman with fewer years left and less importance in the world. Someone easier to take from because society already expected older women to shrink quietly into the background. David's voice became terrifyingly calm. Don't come near my mother again. Then he ended the call. For several seconds neither of us moved. Outside, snow continued falling gently across Harold's yard. Inside the kitchen, my son sat staring at the phone in his hand like a man mourning someone still alive. By Sunday morning, the story had already spread through the family. Not the full truth. Just fragments. Enough to make everyone uncomfortable. My sister Claire called twice before breakfast pretending she just wanted to check in. My niece suddenly texted asking if I needed groceries delivered. Even neighbors seemed strangely careful while speaking to me at church. People sense disaster long before details arrive. David stayed at my house all weekend. He told me he couldn't bear going home. I didn't ask questions after that. Some heartbreaks are too fresh to examine directly. That afternoon, while I folded laundry in the living room, David came downstairs holding a small black folder in his hands. His expression alone made my stomach tighten. What is it? I found this in the safe at the house. I stared at the folder slowly. The safe Vanessa said she never touched? He nodded once. A humorless smile crossed my face. Apparently she touched everything else. David sat beside me carefully and opened the folder. Inside were printed statements, legal documents, and handwritten notes in Vanessa's neat cursive writing. Budgets. Transfer schedules. Account balances. And worst of all, a page labeled, Long-Term Family Financial Plan. My chest tightened painfully. David stared down at the paper in disbelief. Underneath several columns of projected savings was one sentence circled in blue ink. Eleanor's expenses can be minimized over time. Minimized. I repeated the word silently in my mind, as if I were a utility bill. A subscription service. Not a human being. David looked physically sick. She planned this, he whispered. I didn't answer immediately, because suddenly I remembered dozens of tiny moments differently. Vanessa encouraging me to sell the house. Vanessa saying retirement communities were safer for seniors. Vanessa insisting large homes became burdens at my age. At the time, her concern sounded practical. Now every word felt calculated. David flipped through more pages, then froze suddenly. Oh my God. What? He handed me another document. It was a draft proposal for selling my home. My fingers began trembling instantly. There, typed neatly across the top, was my address. Estimated sale value. Projected renovation costs. Suggested listing timeline. And handwritten beside one note, Once Eleanor relocates. I could barely breathe. She was planning to sell my house? David looked devastated. I think she thought eventually you'd move into assisted living. The room spun slightly around me. This house. Harold built the back deck himself. We planted maple trees in the yard when David was 5. Every Christmas morning, every birthday, every family dinner lived inside these walls. And somewhere along the way, someone had started viewing it as inventory. Tears blurred my vision suddenly. Not loud tears. Just quiet grief too exhausted to stay hidden anymore. David moved closer immediately. Mom! She wanted my whole life erased. I whispered. No, his voice cracked sharply. I let someone make you feel erasable. That sentence hurt more than anything else. Because I knew how much guilt was crushing him now. I reached for his hand gently. This isn't all on you. But he looked away. And I realized forgiveness would come much easier for me than it ever would for him. His phone buzzed suddenly. Vanessa again. This time there was no crying message. No apologies. Just one sentence. If you destroy me, you destroy yourself too. David stared at the text silently. Then another message arrived. You have no idea what I sacrificed for this family. I watched my son's face harden slowly. Not with rage. With clarity. That frightened me more. Because anger can fade. Clarity rarely does. What sacrifices? He muttered bitterly. Then his phone rang immediately afterward. He answered without speaking. Vanessa's voice exploded through the speaker this time. You're humiliating me, she shouted. David remained perfectly calm. You stole from my mother. I managed things, she snapped back. Someone had to think about the future. The future. His voice lowered dangerously. You stole medication money from a 70-year-old widow. Silence. Then Vanessa said quietly, she would have left it all to us eventually anyway. The words hit the room like shattered glass. I closed my eyes, and in that moment, something inside me finally died completely. Not trust. That had already gone. Not even affection. It was the last tiny instinct to excuse her. Because anyone who could justify suffering that casually had stopped seeing me as family long ago. David ended the call without another word. The house became silent again except for the ticking clock above the fireplace. Then my son looked at me with tears standing in his eyes. And for the first time since Harold died, he looked truly afraid. Mom, he whispered. How long have you been pretending everything was okay? I didn't answer David's question right away. How long had I been pretending everything was okay? Longer than I should have. Long enough that pretending eventually became habit. I looked down at my hands resting quietly in my lap. The skin looked thinner now than it used to. Older. Friendlier somehow. I think, I said slowly, it started after your father died. David sat across from me in complete silence. When someone loses their husband after 46 years, I continued softly, people expect them to become smaller. The words surprised even me once they were spoken aloud. But they were true. After Harold passed away, everyone suddenly treated me differently. More carefully. More gently. And somehow less seriously. Neighbors offered sympathy with pity in their eyes. Bank employees explained things slower than necessary. Doctors directed questions toward David instead of me whenever he accompanied me to appointments. And Vanessa stepped naturally into that space. Helpful. Capable. Efficient. She kept telling me not to stress anymore. I whispered. At first it sounded kind. David lowered his eyes immediately. But eventually, I said, I stopped feeling like the owner of my own life. The room grew quiet again. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor while snow drifted softly outside the windows. I suddenly felt exhausted clear down to my bones. David leaned forward slowly. There's something else I need to tell you. My stomach tightened instantly. What is it? He hesitated before answering. The bank found another linked account this morning. I stared at him carefully. What kind of account? A medical trust. The words hit me like ice water. Harold had mentioned setting something aside years ago in case either of us faced serious health problems during retirement. I'd never asked details. Money discussions always made me uncomfortable. Harold handled investments. I handled the home. That was simply how our marriage worked. David swallowed hard. The account was nearly emptied. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Harold had worked overtime for years building security for our future. He skipped vacations, delayed retirement twice, fixed things himself instead of hiring contractors, all to make sure I'd never struggle after he was gone. And now pieces of his life's work had quietly disappeared. How much? I asked finally. David's voice barely rose above a whisper. Almost $90,000. I closed my eyes. 90,000. I suddenly remembered Vanessa convincing me to postpone knee surgery last year because recovery would be too difficult at your age. At the time I believed she was concerned for me. Now I wondered if she simply didn't want medical expenses interrupting her plans. The thought made me physically ill. David stood and walked toward the fireplace again. Restless energy radiating from him now. I don't even know who I married. His voice sounded hollow. I watched him carefully. Heartbreak changes men differently than women sometimes. Women often collapse inward first. Men tend to look stunned, as if betrayal rearranged reality faster than their minds can follow. There were signs, he muttered bitterly. God, there were so many signs. I stayed quiet, 'cause he needed to say it aloud now. She hated when I visited you alone. He laughed softly without humor. She always had some reason to come with me. I remembered. Family dinners where Vanessa answered questions directed at David. Phone calls interrupted because she needed him. Holidays shortened because she claimed exhaustion. At the time it seemed controlling. Now it looks strategic. She isolated you, David whispered suddenly. Not just financially. Emotionally. Gradually. Carefully. The realization hit both of us at the same moment. If Vanessa controlled access to me, she controlled information too. What David knew. What I knew. What each of us believed about the other. And suddenly 3 years of distance between mother and son looked much less accidental. A sharp knock at the front door startled both of us. David immediately stiffened. Neither of us had expected visitors. He moved toward the window cautiously and looked outside. Then frowned. It's Claire. My sister entered carrying a casserole dish wrapped carefully in towels against the cold. But the moment she saw our faces, her expression changed. Oh no, she whispered softly. She set the casserole down without removing her coat. I just came to check on you, she said gently. People are talking. David rubbed a hand over his face. I'm sure they are. Claire looked between us carefully, then finally asked the question everyone else was probably whispering already. Is it true Vanessa took the money? The room fell silent. And for the first time since this nightmare began, saying the truth aloud suddenly made everything feel terrifyingly real. Claire sat very still after asking the question. The casserole dish remained untouched on my kitchen counter, while snow continued falling outside in soft silence. For a moment nobody answered her. Then David finally spoke. Yes. Just one word. But hearing it spoken aloud changed everything. Claire slowly lowered herself into a chair beside the table. Her expression shifted from concern to heartbreak almost instantly. Oh, Eleanor. I hated the pity in her voice. Not because she meant harm. Because I was beginning to drown in pity from everyone lately. Widow. Old woman. Victim. Each label shrinking me smaller in people's minds. Claire reached for my hand carefully. How much did she take? David laughed once under his breath. A tired, hollow sound. We're still finding accounts. Claire's face paled. My God. The grandfather clock ticked softly in the hallway while evening darkness settled outside. The windows. The house suddenly felt crowded with grief. Not just mine. David's too. Claire looked toward him gently. Where's Vanessa now? His jaw tightened immediately. At the house. You left her there alone? She refused to leave. Claire hesitated, then quietly asked the question none of us wanted to say aloud. Are you divorcing her? David stared at the floor. And for the first time since this all began, he looked afraid to answer. Because betrayal destroys more than trust. It destroys futures people already imagined living. I don't know, he admitted softly. The honesty in his voice hurt me deeply. I remembered my wedding day to Harold 50 years ago. We had almost no money. The church flowers were borrowed from another ceremony earlier that morning. Our honeymoon was a 2-night stay in a roadside motel outside Nashville. But I never once questioned whether Harold was safe to build a life beside. David had believed the same thing about Vanessa. That was what made this tragedy so brutal. Claire suddenly looked at me again. Eleanor, why didn't you tell anyone you were struggling financially? I smiled faintly, because the answer felt embarrassingly simple. I didn't want my son worrying about me. David closed his eyes immediately, and I realized those words would probably haunt him for years. His phone buzzed suddenly against the table again. This time he didn't even check the screen. She keeps calling? Claire asked softly. All day. What does she want? David finally looked up. To explain. Claire's expression hardened instantly. There's no explanation for stealing from family. But David stayed quiet. Because deep down, part of him still searched desperately for one anyway. That's the terrible thing about loving someone deeply. Even after betrayal, your heart keeps looking for reasons not to let go. The front porch light flickered softly through the curtains while wind rattled bare tree branches outside. Then David suddenly stood. I need to go back to the house. Both Claire and I looked up immediately. Why? I asked carefully. There are still documents there. His voice turned flat again. And I need answers. Fear moved quietly through me. Not fear of Vanessa. Fear of what more truth might do to my son. I'll come with you, Claire offered immediately. No, David grabbed his coat from the chair. I need to do this alone. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. Like the last 72 hours had stripped years off his life. Before leaving, he stopped beside me near the doorway. I'm sorry, Mom. The pain in his voice nearly shattered me. I touched his face gently the way I used to when he was little. You have nothing to apologize for. But he shook his head slowly. I brought her into this family. Then he walked out into the falling snow. Claire and I stood silently at the window watching his headlights disappear down the street. Neither of us spoke for a long time afterward. Finally she whispered, "What happens now?" I stared out at the dark winter sky. And for the first time since Harold died, I honestly didn't know. David didn't return that night. Around 11, he texted only 3 words. Found more documents. Nothing else. I sat awake in Harold's recliner long after Claire went home, listening to the wind push softly against the house. The Christmas lights across the street blinked red and gold through the darkness while an old jazz station played quietly from the kitchen radio. Sleep felt impossible now. Every time I closed my eyes, memories surfaced differently. Vanessa helping me sort Harold's clothes after the funeral. Vanessa insisting she drive me to doctor appointments. Vanessa gently saying, "You shouldn't worry about complicated things anymore." At the time I thought she was caring for me. Now I wondered if she had simply been reducing me piece by piece. Sometime after midnight, headlights swept across the living room window. David. The moment he walked through the front door, I knew something terrible had happened. He looked numb. Not angry anymore. Not shocked. Just emptied out. Without speaking, he placed a cardboard file box onto the dining room table. Documents spilled everywhere. Bank statements. Property records. Tax files. Insurance paperwork. And sitting on top, a yellow legal pad covered in Vanessa's handwriting. I stared at it quietly. What is that? David laughed bitterly. A plan. He handed me the notebook carefully. My fingers trembled slightly as I read. Future property liquidation, retirement transition options, long-term asset strategy. Every line made my stomach turn colder. Beside my house address, Vanessa had written, "Best timing after Eleanor relocates." Relocates. Not if. After. Further down the page. Assisted living discussion easier after another health scare. I stopped breathing for a moment. David looked physically ill. She was waiting, he whispered. The room suddenly felt unbearably small. Not because of the money anymore. Because someone had quietly been planning the end of my independence while smiling across holiday dinners. I sat down slowly. She wanted me gone. David crouched beside my chair immediately. "Mom." But I barely heard him. Another line on the page caught my eye. David emotionally resistant now, gradual approach better. I stared at the words in silence. Gradual approach. Like I was some obstacle requiring management. Not a mother. Not a widow. Not even a person. Just a problem to solve slowly. David grabbed the notebook suddenly and threw it across the table. I can't even look at this anymore. His voice cracked hard this time. For several seconds neither of us moved. Then quietly, almost ashamed, he whispered, "How did I marry someone like this?" I looked at my son carefully, and suddenly I realized he needed saving too. Not financially. Emotionally. Because betrayal like this destroys a person's confidence in their own judgment. "You married the version she showed you," I said softly. He sat heavily across from me. "But the signs were there." "Maybe," I admitted gently. "But good people don't naturally search for manipulation." Tears filled his eyes instantly. That broke my heart more than anything else. Not the stolen money. Not the lies. My son blaming himself for loving someone he trusted. The kitchen clock ticked softly past midnight. Finally David spoke again. "There's one more thing." His voice sounded distant now. "What?" He slid a final folder across the table.
Divorce consultation papers.
Prepared 2 months earlier. My chest tightened sharply. She was planning to leave him anyway. Harold's old voice seemed to whisper somewhere deep inside my memory. David stared blankly ahead. She already met with attorneys. I opened the file slowly. Asset division estimates. Property evaluations. Projected spousal support calculations. And highlighted near the bottom, expected inheritance factors. A chill ran through my entire body. Inheritance. Even before leaving the marriage, she was calculating what remained to gain. David looked utterly shattered now. Not because his marriage was ending, because he realized it may never have been what he believed in the first place. Finally, after a long silence, he said something quietly that made my chest ache. "She never loved this family." I looked toward Harold's photograph resting near the fireplace. And for the first time since all this began, anger finally replaced grief inside me. Not loud anger. Not revenge. Just a calm, cold understanding. Some people don't destroy families all at once. They do it slowly. Politely. One signature. One lie. One manipulation at a time. Vanessa moved out 3 days later. Not dramatically. No screaming. No shattered dishes or slammed doors. Just quiet movement through the house. David once believed they would grow old and together. By then, attorneys were already involved. The bank had frozen multiple accounts pending investigation, and several fraudulent authorizations had been formally flagged. David handled most of the conversations himself because, as he told me gently one morning, "You've carried enough already." I didn't argue. For the first time in years, I stopped trying to manage everyone else's pain before my own. The strangest part was how ordinary everything still looked afterward. People still walked dogs down my street every morning. Church bells still rang on Sundays. Snow still gathered softly along Harold's maple trees in the yard. The world had not ended. Only an illusion had. One afternoon in early December, David came over carrying a cardboard box from the house. "I found more of Dad's things," he said quietly. We opened it together at the dining room table. Inside were old photographs, retirement papers, warranty folders Harold never threw away, and beneath everything else, a sealed envelope with my name written across the front. Eleanor. Just seeing Harold's handwriting nearly took my breath away. My fingers trembled as I opened it carefully. Inside was a single handwritten letter folded twice down the center. David stayed silent while I read. "My darling Eleanor, if you're reading this, then I'm probably being stubborn somewhere in heaven and arguing with the angels about proper lawn maintenance." A small laugh escaped me through sudden tears. That sounded exactly like Harold. Then my eyes moved lower across the page. "I know you. You will try to carry everything quietly so nobody worries about you. Please don't. You spent your whole life protecting this family. Now let them protect you too. And one more thing. If money ever changes the hearts around you, promise me you will remember your worth was never tied to what you could give people. You were the best part of this family long before we had anything worth stealing." I had to stop reading for a moment. The room blurred completely. Across the table, David covered his eyes with one hand. I continued softly, "Take care of our son. And remind him that guilt is useless unless it teaches you how to love people better afterward. Love always, Harold. Silence filled the room after I finished. Not empty silence. Healing silence. The kind that settles slowly after truth finally stops fighting to stay hidden. David wiped at his eyes roughly before laughing once under his breath. Dad always knew everything before everyone else. Yes, I whispered. He usually did. Outside, afternoon sunlight reflected brightly across the snow-covered yard. For the first time in weeks, the house no longer felt haunted by tension. Just memory. Warm memory. David looked at me carefully then. What happens now? I folded Harold's letter gently back into the envelope. Now, I said softly, we rebuild honestly. He nodded slowly. The legal process continued for months after that. Vanessa's reputation collapsed quickly once financial records surfaced. Some relatives tried defending her at first. Others avoided the subject entirely. I no longer cared, because something important had changed inside me. I stopped shrinking. Stopped apologizing for needing space in my own family. Stopped acting grateful for basic dignity. And strangely enough, once I stopped accepting less, people around me began treating me differently too. Especially David. He visited every weekend after that. Sometimes we cooked dinner together. Sometimes we simply sat on the porch drinking coffee while snow melted slowly across the yard Harold loved so much. Neither of us spoke much about Vanessa anymore. Some wounds heal better without constant touching. Then one quiet Sunday morning near Christmas, David arrived carrying a small wooden sign. What's this? I asked. He smiled faintly. A replacement. Together we walked outside into the cold winter sunlight. The old mailbox near the road still leaned slightly left the way Harold never quite managed to fix. David carefully removed the worn nameplate attached beneath it. Then he screwed in the new one. Whitmore Family Home. It's in 1978. I stared at the sign quietly while emotion tightened painfully in my throat. Because for the first time since Harold died, this house finally felt like mine again. David stepped beside me silently. I'm sorry it took me so long to see what was happening, he whispered. I slipped my arm gently through his. They stole money for 3 years, I said softly. Snow drifted lightly around us while church bells echoed somewhere in the distance. But the saddest thing, I continued, is that they almost stole my son too. And this time they didn't succeed. Bottom of form.